Hello and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first English language Pakistani defense news and analysis podcast. It's me, Bilal, and I have with me today Arslan Khan. Hi Arslan, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you, Bilal?
I'm doing well. So I guess just dive right into it. Last week, the Pakistan Army Rocket Force Command tested another Fatah IV ground-launched cruise missile. I think from the footage that we were able to all see, there was a bit of I think there was like an airburst slash thermobaric warhead at play. And I think given that it hit the inflatable target almost directly, I think it had like a tighter CEP, circular error probe, or circular error probable. I think from there's probably a potential terminal stage seeker, maybe the imaging infrared involved. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so what we clearly saw was an airburst warhead. So it's actually the first time as well we've seen the Pakistan Army in any, or even the Air Force or any armed forces branch use an actual target in a missile test, at least that we've seen publicly. So we saw a target, an inflatable decoy of a gravestone radar from the S-400 system. I think that's probably quite important here is with the accuracy and with the fact that we actually saw a target. I have a suspicion that this is a case of a new seeker option, an IRR, an infrared imaging seeker. With the decoy, the purpose of the decoy being there, maybe some testing some its image recognition algorithms and whatnot as well. And actually, there was another angle published later where you could see a seeker window at the front of the missile, but also the intake had changed. So yeah, I think the key sort of idea behind this test was a validation of its terminal stage seeker, but also the first time that we've seen this type of warhead be demonstrated, which is an airburst warhead. And the idea sort of behind this warhead type is to cause the most damage possible over a larger area. So this is particularly useful when it comes to taking out air defense systems, for example, because you don't need a direct hit on something. So for example, if you've got a radar that you're aiming for, you don't need a direct hit there. You sort of hit you sort of explode in a general area, and that will create a blast radius so significant that anything in the sort of range will get pulverized anyway. So I think that's the key here. This seemed to be more of a validation of its sort of seeker, its terminal stage seeker, and also its image recognition type stuff. But also the first time we've seen such a warhead.
Sweet. So I think it'd be good to sort of revisit some aspects about the Fatah series or the Fatah IV in particular. I think from my assessment, I believe it is basically, the conventional purpose, conventional variant of the Babur series.
Yeah.
I feel that what's happened is that not necessarily because of the conflict last year. I think all of these motions were in play because before the Fatah IV, we had the Harba NG, which is basically, again, based on the same core frame, but it was positioned as a conventional anti-ship / land attack cruise missile. So I think the move towards a conventional variant of the Babur was already in play and many inputs were already in development at that point. We have like our domestic miniature turbojet engine from NESCOM. Obviously, NESCOM has also been essentially, I think, standardizing a lot of the core inputs across the cruise missiles. So at IDEAS 2024, we saw the actual imaging infrared seeker that they were basically using across all of their, guided munitions. So I think the reason why we keep seeing Pakistan keep bringing up the imaging infrared seeker across its cruise missiles is primarily because I think that's basically in production locally. So they just want to scale that out. And then also some other, for example, like, electronic countermeasure or ECCM hardening that was also shown at IDEAS 2024. I think basically they're moving toward, moving these cruise missiles towards the conventional side. But you mentioned that there was a bit of a revision to the intake. I'd love to get your insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing I would say is probably with the main distinction here between the Babur and the Fatah is you want to focus on scale, right? You need something you can scale up and produce in large numbers. And actually, I would go and say that the Fatah seems to be more of a derivative of the Harba instead. And now you're probably going to say, well, what's the difference? And what I think we see with the Harba is they would have likely got rid of a lot of the cost, the really high cost guidance systems that aren't necessarily relevant for that kind of mission, like the Turcom and the DS-MAC and all that sort of stuff, because there's no terrain to match over the sea, right? And that's really costly, hard to produce, or maybe even hard to import type stuff. And it's not particularly relevant in this case anyway. It's not really needed here. And we see this a lot more on strategic systems where you really want that extra reliability. But here, what I assume we're seeing is a deletion of that sort of stuff. It frees up a lot more space, but also it brings down the cost and also that increases the scalability of the missile and how much they can produce. So I think the Fatah IV is more of a derivative of the Harba series. And in terms of the intake, so obviously there was a very grainy footage, but what you could see is it sort of features a more like Block 4 Tomahawk type intake. And same as the Indian cruise missile in class, I forget its name. And that's obviously a play into, decreasing your radar cross section and increasing your survivability by reducing any of these radar cross section, increasing sort of protrusions. So I think that's another play there. And it just shows you that they're continually developing these missiles. It's not really like, okay, look, we've done this and that's it. Let's call it a day. It's a continuous development. We saw the Fatah first unveiled last year, whatever. So within the span of a year, they've iterated, new Seeker, new Warhead, new airframe design, and we'll continue to see these iterations. And actually, it does seem like they're moving towards a common inputs idea, which is a great idea. And a lot of countries are actually moving towards this. We want to standardize as many inputs as we can because it's easier to mass produce, cheaper. And you can channel a lot more of that money into improving them. So we see all of Pakistan's missiles, the Fatah and the Rad series, they were the Rad and the Tamur and whatnot. They also feature a radar option. They also feature an infrared imaging option, and they also feature an INS GPS only option. In the same way, Babur also features INS GPS only, and then you've got Fatah also features a GPS INS only radar also, and now also infrared imaging, which is again a new addition to the family. So yeah, but we see these continual improvements, and we see the standardization on these common inputs like the engines and the seeker options and the guidance. And I think this is what we've been saying for quite a while. This is the way forward because it really allows you to drive those costs down on these particularly expensive, costly inputs like the seekers.
So, you basically alluded towards a bit of, further evolution to the, let's call the land attack cruise missile series, because it's going by 3 different names at this point. Do you foresee a situation, because I personally do, but I just have a bit of a view on how this could take place, but do you foresee a situation where we start seeing extended range variants of the land attack cruise missile? And the reason why I bring it up is that, I look at, for example, India, Turkey, North Korea, for this kind of class of, let's say, Tomahawk-esque cruise missile, they've been basically reaching in excess of 1,000 kilometers. In North Korea's case, you have like 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers, which for me, if that is a true, there's always caveats to whether what they're revealing is accurate information or not. But let's say for this discussion, it is. I think that is in itself is a good sign that when you're under a sanctions regime, under a lot of restrictions, you can't access a lot of controlled equipment. There is evidently a way to get these longer range cruise missiles and produce them. It might just be an issue of funding and time, essentially. And given that we are seeing Pakistan, roll out with the Fatah IV, Harba NG, we're seeing that they are improving the airframe. They're making some very good qualitative steps towards basically at least getting as much as they can out of the airframe. Do you foresee a situation where, for example, they start working with the Chinese on potentially bringing in a miniature turbofan engine and then kind of reset the cycle a little bit where you're mass producing these conventional Tomahawk style cruise missiles with the Turbojet, which gets you to around, let's say, 750 kilometers, give or take. And then you have on you're basically upgrading your strategic stocks with, let's say, like a Babur 2 NG or whatever, the next Babur variant. And that it starts getting into the 1,000 kilometers plus, and then you build those in limited production. And as you get comfortable, those start coming down to the conventional side, like let's say 10, 15 years. Like, do you foresee a situation like that happening?
So, okay. So in terms of extended range, I think one of the things I want to touch on just before going into that is obviously now we're seeing a very clear distinction that the armed forces are making between nuclear and strategic programs and also conventional strike options. And I think that ties into this sort of extended range and also the improvements of the missile is that vendors are going to be a lot less hesitant to work with you if they know that their engine or their seeker or their electronics are not going to end up on a nuclear missile. So I think one of the key things here is obviously the distinction that the Pakistan Armed Forces are making between strategic and non-strategic systems is going to play a crucial part in the improvement of these systems, including their range. Now, obviously, the biggest issue that we face with the range of these missiles is the fact that we're just stuck with an engine that isn't necessarily up to standard relative to other engines. That's not to say it's not doing the job. It's perfectly capable of doing what it's doing, but it's not necessarily relative to something like the Indian in-class missile or the Tomahawk. But the reality is the Tomahawk uses a turbofan, which we just don't have access to. I don't know of any miniature turbofan engines in class. Now there is a Ukrainian option. There's a couple of other options. And there might be something Chinese, but I don't know if anything off the top of my head. But nothing in class, is able to propel a missile of this size to the kind of speeds it needs to. The Babur and the Fatah aren't small missiles by any means, and neither is the Rad. But the reason why they're so large is because you just have to carry so much fuel to be able to meet those ranges, because the engines themselves aren't just necessarily the most efficient ones, but also the warheads. I don't know what type of warhead, the size of the warheads being carried on the conventional series now. But obviously, as we see more optimized warheads and better warheads, we can start to see them shrinking in size. And that would also give you an increase in range. But I do think as time goes on now, and as these missiles are being developed and improved, we will start to see increase in ranges and whatnot. But I think the more important thing is seeing them become more survivable, which is what we're seeing now with these improvements in seeker options, which directly impacts, their flight profile, for example, but also their ability to be able to outmaneuver, say, a Seawiz. So I think the range is something that people tend to focus quite a lot on. But from my perspective, I would prefer something a lot more survivable and something that's hardened against electronic attacks and a lot more of an intelligent missile. And then later we can see improvements in ranges, especially as we see modern electronics being applied as well, because again, that decreases your weight and decreases the size of them, giving you a lower weight and more range. So I think it's kind of like a natural progression. It's sort of knock-on effect.
I agree. So I think, with the range for the time being, I can see Army Rocket Force Command being pretty content with the ranges as they are, because for the most part, the goal is primarily to make that northwest region of India a bit more contested, create a bit of a denial net in that area so that India does not have, let's say, like the ability to mount BrahMos strikes like right across the border. I think they want to create a situation where there is a bit of a buffer where the Indians are forced to sort of move back their missile strike units and their high value assets further to the center and to the east. So that gives the Pakistani side some defensive space. I think that is one consideration there. The other is, as you alluded to and said, basically is like, I think besides survivability, I think they really want to get the mass production side right. In addition to like the common components, them leveraging the Harba, platform for the Fatah 4. I think the idea is, look, we are mass producing these missiles for our needs. Or, yes, it's a big upfront investment to set up the manufacturing facilities for these to produce them at a respectable scale. However, we're going to keep buying these missiles over the long run. We're going to keep testing them. And I have like a point about the testing as well, which I think you brought up as well. But the idea is that they're going to keep testing them very frequently, iterating them, advancing them, and then hopefully, potential customers, if they're interested in buying, and that sort of adds to the amortization. So they're able to spread out the R&D overhead. So you have like a bit of a virtuous cycle. And I think on the testing point, which is really interesting, is that I think you noted this in our conversations earlier, but like this year they've tested more missiles of this caliber, like between the Amur series, the Harba slash Fatah 4 series, the Fatah 2, even from a ballistic side. They've tested more of these missiles this year than they have like in longer periods of time, at
Yeah.
least in terms of vocalizing it. Love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, like I was joking about this, but we tested so many missiles this year. It really points towards the fact that they're able to expend these missiles, right? They're able to test them, they're able to use them, and not have to worry about stockpiles. How before we'd see maybe once or one missile test or one bubble test every year or every other year, for example. Here we've seen since Fatah was released, maybe 2, 3, 4 Fatah 4 tests. So the point is clearly they've got missiles now to expend, and clearly they're scaling up production now. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to conduct these tests in such rapid succession. We've probably seen in excess of 10, 15 missile tests this year.
Absolutely. So next topic is the video which happened to basically hit the webs right after we recorded our previous episode. But it's a video of a Pakistan Army, or maybe the Lone Ranger of Pakistan Army, Z-10 ME-02, equipped with a millimetric wave radar. So, my thoughts on this, and then love to get your thoughts on this as well, Arslan, is that I think given that we're seeing the ARFC, but given how we're seeing this increase in production scale for munitions, given that we're seeing that the PAF is now moving towards its next phase, which is to induct more JF-17s and J-10s, given all this, I feel that the unfortunate consequence of all this is that the Pakistan Army Aviation Corps, their programs have evidently slowed down. I think the sense I got was that from people reviewing the video is that, hey, they're still testing this equipment out. It's still part of some form of integration test fielding process, which I think it's true potentially. I think that this doesn't necessarily take away from what I'm saying, but I feel like their overall programs have sort of slowed down. They're probably at the tail end of the big modernization development cycle that the armed forces have in mind, for obvious reasons, because they're sort of the way I kind of frame them, and if you start reviewing the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, and even how the U.S. Army is viewing its attack helicopters, I think they've sort of changed from being that source of a mass anti-armor infantry suppression asset, because now you can swap those in with drones and other, even like guided artillery and other methods, to something of more of like a quasi special forces, air assault, rapid response, like a very niche, high quality. I don't want to say nice to have. I think they're essential in Pakistan's case, but a high value capability, basically, a very high value capability that needs to sort of be rethunk. They have to rethink it quite a bit. I think in a way, the Army Aviation Corps has to sort of revisit a lot of its old assumptions and maybe sort of readapt itself for a new future. So in that vein, that being said, I think the Z10 ME2 has been selected. If you look through the Army's recent ISPR video, basically, they sort of framed it as like a node within their network-enabled warfare element. They're testing out, and I think this is a good sign. They're testing out very high-powered sensors. I mean, we haven't seen in the past Army aviation units mount any form of radar on a millimetric wave radar. I think we'll probably see them, whether it's through drones or maybe some other assets, start to also talk more about ground facing synthetic aperture radars, for example. So all these things are very useful for them, and I think in that sense, and also for example, man unmanned teaming, that's another area they have to sort of figure out. So I think in that sense, I feel like the Army Aviation Corps is sort of relearning a lot of things, and that basically they got these units, or let's say unit from China, just to basically test out, field out. That being said, I know they've selected it for now, but I think that they might, because we haven't seen them go full steam with an induction process yet, like, setting up train, to our knowledge. I mean, perhaps they are, right? Again, that information hasn't been released. We'll find out in like the next MODP report. But maybe they are working towards the induction. Maybe they are sending teams to train in China. Who knows? But I think also, they're looking at how the Chinese industry is developing their next heavyweight attack helicopter. They're looking at the Turks. There's still you have the British, the Italians, the AW249. So I think they're still looking around to say, okay, it's not so much that the Z10ME is not sufficient or sufficient, more like, are these platforms evolving? Do they need to become bigger? Do they need to mount more sensors? Are they becoming more of like command nodes for drones? I think there's so much in flux that they just don't know yet. And I think that's where they're stuck. That's my thought.
Yeah, I mean, we've made a really good in-depth dive episode before on the Z, and particularly what it brings to the table in terms of the new technologies and new capabilities. I don't know if we can link that in the description, but maybe it might be worth doing so. Effectively, I actually, well, what I think is going on here is it's really just a case of that they are still just evaluating the platform. Obviously, there's a bunch of new changes that have been made to the Z10ME after the previous recommendation, including the engine. And I think the Pakistan Army Aviation is going to want to be a little bit more careful. And what they're doing now is they really want to thoroughly evaluate this thing, because you don't want to commit to a massive order and be stuck with something that is just insufficient for your needs. Particularly, and then, making changes once a delivery is made is not cheap, not easy, not convenient. So I think that's one of the biggest things. But also in terms of the relevance of systems like this, the Z10ME is quite an interesting one, because it's quite based off of what we can tell from just public information, is it's not like your traditional attack helicopter, not the ones we've seen at least, or the ones that the army has had access to in the past. It packs a ton of sensors on board. It brings the army a new capability. The army's never been able to launch cruise missiles from its attack helicopters, or from anywhere other than the ground, for that matter. You've got cruise missiles, you've got new other more intelligent missiles, and obviously you've got now a top attack MMW. There's a lot of new capabilities that the Z10ME brings, and obviously you've got network centric capabilities now as well. So a lot of new capabilities that come with the Z10ME. But I think beyond everything, is it just comes down to the fundamentals that the army is really trying to make sure that it is suitable for their needs, it's suitable for the operational environment, and it meets the needs. It meets the needs of them well. Before they go ahead and commit to an order, because realistically, there's no reason that there shouldn't be more of them in service by now. It's been over a year maybe since we saw first inducted, but we've not seen any follow-up orders. We've not seen any additional units. So clearly, to me, that sort of indicates that the army is continuing to test the platform out.
I have a little bit of a hot take, because I agree with you in that, the sense I get is that because the army is taking its time testing the system and sort of building around it again, and trying to figure out ways to integrate it into their wider operations, that before they commit to a large order, tells me that they are thinking of a larger order. Potentially, it could be quite a significant order if they're taking this much time to evaluate and test it. Because if you notice, they jumped on the AH1Z and T129 pretty quick relative to this. And I don't think anything, I think once the ME was released, I think the ME largely satisfied the requirements from the sense of being a helicopter. I think now it's like they're really just trying to figure out what the conceptual conceptual of operation, the concept of operations will be. That being said, it's very interesting that the Army Aviation is taking this slow pace with the program, and it's the sort of thing I would expect the PAF to take with the next generation fighter. So what I mean by that is that I'm basically kind of putting a little bit of cold water on that theory of the PAF, having J-35s very soon. However, there is a situation where that could happen, but again, it would be deceptive to say that they're inducting it. It could be that we might see a situation in a couple of years where they do get 1 or 2 units for this kind of purpose, basically, which is to acclimate, see how it works. I think iron out the kinks. And I wonder if that's what's happening with the Army, and that's something the PF is thinking about as well. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
I've got an even more out there theory. I don't know if you remember back when this was. I think this was when the our Air Force was looking for a new fighter back in like the 90s, and there was Mirages on offer and whatnot, and Mirage 2000s on offer. And I don't know if you remember, but the Pakistan Air Force had evaluated flankers and was pushing quite hard for flankers, but they had no intention to actually buy them. They wanted to just use it as a pressure tactic. And I don't see, any reason why we can't necessarily be seeing the same thing here as well, is that the Pakistan Army is sort of using this Z10, showing it off as well. This is the other thing, is they're really, really public about it. They're showing it off quite a lot. And, for a single unit that's just being evaluated, we didn't even see this much showing off when we had 2 or 3 units here in the previous evaluation. The Army's really showing it off and making it known that they're evaluating this aircraft. Who's to say that isn't necessarily a pressure tactic to go ahead and get the T129s released, or maybe even the AH1Zs? But I think that ship is, I think they've been sold on now. But particularly the T129s, who's to say that this isn't necessarily a pressure tactic being employed by the Army as well? That's another sort of bit more of a wild theory.
Well, I mean, fairness to that, again, at the end of the day, within the wider spectrum of, within the wider spectrum of the modernization roadmap, I think Army Aviation has sort of been, again, put at the tail end, along with the PF's like need for new transport aircraft, is like right at the end of all that, because these are things that are high value, but right now they just have more pressing issues. I think in that sense, Army Aviation, they have the flexibility to do this kind of stuff, because it's like, what do we have to lose internally? We still don't have like this priority or urgency right now. So we're just going to do all this stuff. But that being said, once you start digging into Army Aviation, and we have like a demand tracker report coming out for the PUA Pro customers, but once you start digging in, is that there's a lot of stuff that, once that ball gets rolling, whenever that might be, like it could be 2030 onwards, there's a lot of stuff that has to get fixed within Army Aviation, right? From a procurement standpoint, their transport utility helicopters are in general like 20, 25, 30 plus years old, right? And the Pumas are just way past that at this point, but they haven't found a track to get even like successors for those, which are like a 6 to 8 ton helicopter. The Bell 412s are aging as well, and those are from the war and terror times. Then you have like obviously like the larger Mi 117, 171s. So there's a lot of questions with that. And I know with folks, they might just say, well, they can just go and buy stuff from China. The thing is, China has a massive domestic need. And the thing about rotary craft is that unless you acquire a platform that's commercially well supported, with a wide multi-source, availability of supply support, maintenance support, spare parts. If you're like a single source operator on one of these helicopters, these can get really expensive. And if there's any critique you might have about the Z10, irrespective of how good a helicopter it is, evidently, right? I'm sure the Army aviation pilots and engineers, or pilots at least, would attest that it's a good helicopter. But when you get into long-term maintenance, being a single or 1 or 2 users can get extremely expensive really quick. Unless,
Yeah.
that's why if you look at a good example of, the last pulse check episode with Asim, was that the unit cost of the T129 and AH1Z were very similar, even though the AH1Z was the bigger, more durable, combat proven, maybe even more sophisticated helicopter, right, in every aspect. But the unit prices were almost the same, 50 million, give or take, per unit. Why is that? Well, it's because in that, with the T129, when Pakistan was negotiating for it, it was like the second customer, essentially, meaning that besides Turkey, you're the only other one. And that, again, that was, and I think with the reason why that deal was able to get through was that Turkey put in a lot of concessions for Pakistan.
Yeah.
One was that the actual financing was done by the Turkish government. So it wasn't even a commercial loan. The Pakistan Army, the reason why they signed on to that deal, because folks would ask, like, why did they sign on to that deal? Why did they make that mistake? Well, it wasn't really a mistake. It actually was nothing to lose, because what happened was that the Turkish government said that they will pay for those helicopters, so that they'll pay Turkish Aerospace to build those helicopters. So if a deal with Pakistan was to break down for any reason, the Turkish government will take responsibility for those helicopters. So not a single dollar left Pakistan for those helicopters. That's number one. So that's a huge concession right there. Meaning we were able to sign a deal without even like putting a dollar down. Huge concession on the Turks, from the Turks. Second is that in Ideas 2018, I spoke to Turkish Aerospace and I asked him about these programs, about the T129, and what he said was that the Turkish Aerospace has a vision that they want to set up eventually like a MRO center within Pakistan to support not just the T-29, but to support the training, maintenance, and all the support stuff for all the regional customers of all Turkish helicopters. So let's say if Kazakhstan, Pakistan started buying these helicopters, they would be serviced in Pakistan. If Bangladesh was able to buy Attack helicopters, which they might, I think from what I recall, they were in negotiations or they're like interested in it, those would be serviced within Pakistan. So meaning that in addition to putting up even in addition to guaranteeing the loan and making it a very favorable loan, Turks were willing to put in money and investment within Pakistan as well. So the Turks, to their credit, and this is why we are like kind of sometimes we get a little bit of, we throw a little bit of cold water on the Chinese side. We don't mean to offend anyone, right? We're not trying to be pro-Western or anything here. We're just laying out the facts, right? And one of the things we have, one of the undercurrents within KUA is that we're thinking about economics, thinking about long-term development. We're thinking about ways of building a warfighting engine, right? Like that lasts, that is sustainable, right? That involves the Pakistani economy and stuff. So this is one thing I wanted to bring up, is that, and to your point, is that all these factors could be in play as well. And the Army Aviation is just like, hey, look, we're just going to play around with this helicopter, not to be disrespectful about it, but be like, hey, I think it could still factor in as the heavyweight requirement in lieu of the H-1Z, but I think they're still holding the horse. They're not committing the money yet because they actually might believe that there's another option coming as well. And the other thing is that because rotary crafts can get expensive to operate, it's also a good idea to try to build as much commonality between your utility and attack and transport and attack. So that's where, in the US, the Apache and the Black Hawk, they share the same core engine platform, T700 series or T800 series. The EH1Z, the Viper and the Venom Huey, those two are virtually identical, like 85% of the way through. They're basically the same airframe, same helicopter. They just have very marginal differences, so they're much easier to maintain. So that's one thing the U.S. Marine Corps did. The Turks are developing a engine like a 1400 horsepower turboshaft engine. So that has been validated, approved. It's under mass production for the utility helicopter. It could potentially make its way to the attack helicopter as well. Again, you would have to reopen the entire testing phase again and go through all the kinks again. But I think the Army Aviation is a lot of stuff they have to sort of evaluate and be careful with, because if you don't plan the procurement stuff correctly, you end up in a situation where, again, you're back where they're at today, where they have like these different helicopter types, small numbers everywhere, relatively expensive, and they don't really fit in potentially, arguably, with where the Army would need them to be. Like, for example, I think one area is that I would love to see our air assault capabilities improve, where we can rapidly deploy light commando battalion units to the western border, eastern border, whenever there's a risk of some sort of escalation situation. So, for example, you have like some sort of high risk, high danger incursion from Afghanistan. Wouldn't it be good that in addition to the air power, you're able to deploy really well-trained soldiers with attack helicopters, with transport helicopters, with drone support, with guided artillery support, all in that area, and just so viciously neutralize the threat that no one bothers trying it again. And similarly, if India was to try another, quote unquote, surgical operation in the LOC, wouldn't you want a capable force to be able to respond to them on the ground? Again, with that, with the rapid mobility assets coming in and just, again, establishing that level of deterrence on the ground there. So I think that is where I personally feel where the Army wants to take things. And then that means they just have to really rethink these things and be very careful with the Army Aviation stuff. But that being said, for the vendors, like, this could be a huge opportunity. And I know with Leonardo, for example, the AW149 and AW249, again, they share a common platform between the attack, utility, and transport. I know with the Chinese, I believe Z20, Z21, same idea. They share a common platform. So this stuff the industry is changing and beginning to offer stuff. You might want to just be patient. That's my point, basically.
Yeah, basically.
The next thing, so this was supposed to be a topic, but the actual source material was basically false. But the idea is that, but we sort of reframed it. So, just going back to last week, Vice Marshal Ghazi's statements. I mean, we can all agree that at this point, the PAF is still invested within the JF-17. However, the production of the Block 3 is still limited to about 30 units. There were some purported photos of later stage production units, like up to 50, but from what I understand, Arslan, these are not genuine.
Yeah, they're
So
fake.
that being said, I think directionally the PF is looking towards more JF-17s. I think it's an issue of funding at this point. And then I think maybe they might have just cut the Block 3 and are moving towards PFX Alpha, which you can just consider like a Block 3 plus / Block 4. Just an upgrade of the avionics, radars, and what have you. That being
Yeah.
said, I would really emphasize like the JF-17 is is going to remain with the PEF. I think they're going to add more units. It's their primary strike platform. I mean, if you look at it, they've invested so much in integrating different standoff munitions to it that even the J-10 doesn't necessarily have. So for example, if they're more air-launched cruise missile, the Azub series glide bombs, I mean, that's an investment, right? I don't see them walking that back, considering this is the same Air Force that operates T-37s to this day. So I don't think they're going to walk away from JF-17s anytime soon. I think they're going to keep investing in those, obviously in parallel with the J-10s, just to basically sharpen the air-to-air and the multi-role stuff. But I think the interesting topic here, Arslan, is that, look, eventually at some point, very soon, I would say by the end of this decade, the PAF fighter fleet will 95-100% be composed of at least fourth generation, but maybe primarily even 4.5, 4+ generation fighter aircraft. Like I could see a situation where more than half of the fleet has active ESA radars, for example. The whole
Yeah.
fleet is using tactical data links. Everyone has BVR munitions in their stockpiles. You have most of the units have precision strike weapons. I mean, there's a lot of capability sets, but the part that worries me is the training pipeline. Because what's happening with the current training pipeline, I mean, I think the argument of saying that the PAF training pipeline at the earlier stages is good enough falls quite a bit once you evaluate against the facts based on what the PAF itself is saying. So
Yeah.
the PAF did have a lift requirement. It still does have a lead-in fighter trainer requirement. It literally vocalized this from Air Chief Marshal Mujahid Anwar Khan's time. Then the other issue is that you cannot argue that the T-37s and the K-8s in their current form, I mean, if you upgrade them, that's a different story, but the K-8s and T-37s are enough to equip your pilots to be ready for even a JF-17 Block 2, like Block 1, Block 2 at this point, let alone Block 3 and the J-10 and so on. Um, and on top of that, they are offloading more of that work to the OCU units. So, for example, you have pilots spending more time at the F-16 OCU unit. You have pilots spending more time at the JF-17 OCU units, or the rather JF-17 OCU aircraft. So, meaning that there's clearly an issue here where that the initial basic advanced training pipeline before the fighter conversion, before the actual OCU stuff, has not reached a point where the OCU can just focus on converting the pilot on the actual core fighter platform, that they still have to continue the teaching. And I think that's a pretty big problem because, from a narrative standpoint, the PAF says, it's the man behind the weapon, it's the man
Yeah.
behind the jet. Well, the problem is that you can't say that on one end, right? And then keep flying trainer aircraft, which are so old, right? Which don't match up with your actual fleet capabilities.
Yeah.
Right? It makes no sense. You can either say that we don't rely on our training as much. We have like super advanced platforms. We have this highly capable, network, multi-domain, blah blah blah, and it does all the work. Okay. You can make that argument. That's fair enough. But then you cannot go around and say, well, we really depend on our training. And when the training stack itself is starting to age a little bit or quite a bit. So I want to get your thoughts on this because I think it's been something that we've kind of gone back and forth with folks.
Yeah.
I think the most measured opinion is that we just don't have the funding. I think it's fair. But then at the same time, I argue that, look, instead of accelerating J-35s, the money you would spend on even half a squadron of those, you can probably redo your entire training pipeline.
Yeah. Well, firstly, if we just touch back on the original point about the JF-17. So with the JF-17 Block 3, I've always maintained that it seems more like an interim solution because there's a lot of stuff that the Pakistan Air Force had wanted and vocalized that they wanted for the Block 3 that just never happened. If we think back a couple of years, they're talking RST, new engines, AESA radars, and all this stuff. And the only thing we only saw was AESA and the inbuilt EW suite. And I'm sure there was more stuff that they wanted as well. So I've always maintained that the Block 3 seems more like an interim side grade, like the Block 2 was, as opposed to a major upgrade and a major upgrade to the fleet. I think with the Block 4, and I'd always said there would be a Block 4. And what I think with this sort of Block 4, I really expect to see more domestic avionics. Also, I think whatever happens with the Block 4 will be used as the basis for the MOU for the older Block 2s. We may not see the Block 1s get MOU'd. I think those airframes will actually probably end up getting binned. I don't know if it makes any sense to even MOU them as opposed to buying new ones. But I think what we're going to end up seeing is a Block 4 a lot more domestic avionics. You know, as I mentioned there before, there's a domestic airborne AESA program in the works. You know, domestic a ton of stuff. You know, domestic missiles and domestic sensor, more sensors and whatnot. So there's
New
a lot.
engine as well, and potentially a new engine as well. They
Yeah,
did
yeah,
test
absolutely. I mean, yeah,
21, I believe.
yeah, I think it slipped from my mind now, but I remember there was some evaluations nearly complete, and you know, to be honest, actually, at this point, they're probably complete as well. So, you know, new engine as well. You know, to create the final form of the JF-17, which is what they're probably calling, which is what they're calling PFX, I assume. And yeah, as I said, so I think that will make it sort of trickle its way down to the older blocks and be the basis for the MLU, and it will be the final iteration of the JF-17. I don't think the Block 3 will be that, and that's why I also think that they're sort of hesitant to place more orders. That, or the sort of cost benefit analysis there says that it may just make more sense just buying into J10s more, or at least at the moment, because from sort of the leaked documents, we saw that the cost of them is actually quite low relative to what you'd expect or for a fighter of its class. And I don't necessarily think the J-17 Block 3 is going to cost any lower or a ton lower, because not only if we look from the perspective of procurement costs, but when we were talking about helicopters, you mentioned that if you're sort of the sole user, you kind of are susceptible to arm twisting and being forced to pay really whatever the supplier wants for, you know, for example, maintenance and support. I mean, that's kind of what we're having to deal with now with the JF-17 is, you know, as the Chinese lose interest in the program and as they start to develop their programs more, you know, they don't want to have their facilities be dedicated to a dead end program, which is not, you know, I wouldn't say the JF-17 is a dead end program, but it's not really that sort of big commercial hit anymore because there's not really anywhere else it can go. So, you know, tons of, you know, they don't want to dedicate facilities and resources to this program. So what's the next best thing? Let's twist their arm and let's extract as much money as we can from them to be able to keep it going. So I think we're kind of running into that sort of stage now, and we have been for the last couple of years, where sustainment and maintenance of the J-17 is starting to get more expensive, which isn't anything unique to the J-17 for what it's worth. And this happens with every platform. As you know, they age, maintenance gets more expensive and whatnot. But the bigger issue here is being the sole user means we're a lot more susceptible to suppliers twisting our arms and telling us and dictating how we do things as opposed to us dictating to them. So yeah, that's sort of first bit. You know, I don't see the Block 3 as being the final evolution. I see the Block 4 as a final evolution. I think that will make up a lot of the the fleet. Apologies for that.
So I just want to make one quick point on what you just added. I think because it's very plausible that the operating costs of the J-17 J-10s might not be too far off, because they're essentially we're talking about single user situations here. That's where I think where the PEF is sitting from is that they basically, and I think even from the PLA's standpoint, that they probably saw there's a bit of an overlap between the J-10 and J-17 in some respects anyways, which is why they probably just walked away from their J-17 orders. If you remember when they first signed the MOU back in 1999, Chinese committed to like 200 units and then that did not happen basically. So I think with that in mind, I think the PEF has sort of seen the same issue. So what I feel is that, look, well, I know the PF has said that the J-10 is capable of air-to-surface operations and all that, but when I look at the way the Chinese use their J-10, it's really primarily as an air-to-air asset. I think it's been optimized. The J-10C especially has been really optimized for that role. And this is how the PF used it within the recent operation as well, primarily as an air-to-air. So what I can see happening is that knowing that the costs of operating and even acquiring them aren't too different, is basically like the PF can't get a strike fighter right now, right? It just, for the life of it, nothing's available. I think they would have loved getting J-16s at this point. Sorry?
I would have loved them getting J-16s as well.
Yeah, like please look, I know we have Russian listeners. If you're listening to this, I mean, when I mean by Russian listeners, I mean Russian government people. Please make it happen.
Even if it's just flank airframes with Chinese systems,
yeah.
anything.
If you do this, goodness, like if you thought Arslan had like love for China, oh my goodness, you're not even going to believe how much love they're going to have for Russia if you do this in the Arslan narrative space. But if you can greenlight the Chinese into selling J-16s or whatever the next variant is, I think that would change the entire equation. But the J-17 is a strike platform. Every munition they've developed from the Timur Azov is basically being piped through the JF. So it's sort of become this like bomb truck essentially. So I think that's what's happening here, is that the J-10 has been optimized for air-to-air. JF-17 might be optimized, especially with like Block 4/PFX Alpha. I think it's going to be potentially optimized for air-to-ground to whatever capacity it can handle.
Yeah. And then I believe you had a follow-up question on, we had a follow-up discussion on the training pipeline.
Yep.
What I actually think with the training stuff is I think, I think what happened of the lift evaluations was it's just so expensive that, it made more sense to just go all in on JF-17s. And I don't really know why we've not gone and turned it into some sort of, project. We talk about PFX and all these sort of unrealistic delusional projects, but let's go back to the basics. Why have we not set up a project to actually turn the JF-17 into a proper lift? Because that's really what we need. Firstly, we've got all the infrastructure needed. We can do everything on the aircraft ourselves. Why have we not gone and why have we not gone and turned the JF-17 into a proper lift? Because that's what the Block 2B was designed to be, a training aircraft, if I'm not mistaken. So going all in on that front, I think would be a better solution because, yeah, as you mentioned before, the training pipeline in its current form is completely insufficient for the needs. Now, if we think back to lift requirements, which I think you will know better, it might actually be worth you repeating them if you know them off by heart.
Yeah. So just before I get there, just one quick point. There have been PAF personnel and retired PAF personnel who have advocated for using the JF-17 as a lift platform. For sure, off the top of my head, retired Air Commodore Kesotofel has been very supportive of that idea. And what it would be is basically you work in the reverse. So you actually start stripping down the JF-17 platform and maybe like incorporating more of the LVC elements, which is like live virtual constructive elements into that and some other dedicated equipment for it. But that's basically the idea. The requirements for the lift were basically down to their basics. It was the must-haves were like an active ESA radar, tactical data link integration, BVR capability, precision strike capability. So I think the idea is both to greatly or properly train the pilots on these workflows, but then also to have like a backup fighter. And then optionally was turbo afterburning engine. So not a must-have, but they really liked the idea, which ended up where because they added that in, the Chinese Hongju basically started offering a afterburning equipped L-15 in 2018 to the PAF. And then that's also the reason why the Korean T-50 was also evaluated, which was an interesting dark horse, right? Like, we say that the PAF would not be interested in American equipment or what have you, but during the lift trials dating back from 2015 to like 2018, they were actually as late as 2017, I think they're testing the Korean one as well. So it shows you like the way they were thinking about it. It was like, yeah, like it was basically meant to be like a lightweight fighter, and I think that's where the overlap with the JF-17 happened, which is why everyone's asking, including yourself, why didn't they just work on the JF-17 and repurpose it as a lift?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's probably the most ideal platform for this as well. You've got the inputs, the AESA and all this sort of stuff, and it ties into the Block 4, right? If we're going to go ahead and develop all this stuff domestically, we need to be able to offset the cost by, actually producing it in large enough numbers. Having it be applicable to a lift, for example, would be another great solution in dropping that cost down, but also it gives you more money to reinvest into other aspects of your training as well, production as well. But the biggest thing is that's what we need here. We don't need J-35s. We don't need all this, sort of forward think, these next generation aircraft. Right now, what the Pakistan Air Force most urgently needs is to be able to replace its older aircraft, but then also really focus in on that training ecosystem, because without a training ecosystem, there is no point in getting these next generation aircraft. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place before we sort of make that leap. And I've always been saying that until we start seeing this infrastructure coming in place, these new this new training pipeline and this new new aircraft shelters and all this sort of stuff, I don't know if we're as close to a next generation induction as people like to make it out to be. And obviously, the Air Force scuttled those claims anyway the other day when they said that we're looking at options, we're evaluating options, we're not committed to anything, yet people still seem to be making predictions that they'll be showing up on the 14th of August.
Yeah, I mean, look, and going back to the earlier point, I can definitely see a scenario where they do get one or two J-35s. But again, it'll be in this really limited, the way the Army is using the Z-10ME. Like, the problem is that, look, we haven't even seen the Chinese themselves test the J-35 with its weapons and stuff. Like, the weapon qualifications are far from done. Then you're going to have NESCOM saying, hey, we want to integrate the Rasub into that, which they should definitely ask for. And then the Azov 81 LR. And then that's going to be a whole other slew of qualifications that have to get done. I mean, I think folks need to really think of just how long it took the JF-17 to get to this point. The first JF-17s were inducted in like the early 2010s, right? Those were the Block 1s, and a lot of compromises had to be done to get the Block 1 into service, to the point where now we're at a situation where the PF would just be better off replacing the Block 1 with like a Block 4, because you just can't upgrade those forward, right? Because they had to accelerate some things and cut some things, and then you ended up with, for example, the Block 1 has like this hybrid flight control system, right? Whereas the Block 3s have the fully digital flight control system. Those were the kind of compromises they had to make to get the Block 1 going. And that's, it's interesting. I just want to like touch on what the Indians would do. The Indian Air Force wouldn't even accept that kind of fighter, right? Because they would say, look, we had a requirement, it has to be that, right? Is this as a PF had a more pragmatic view and they just need they had the urgency. Their needs were just really urgent. They needed that BBR capability at scale. So that's the point, is that the J-35 stuff is going to take some time, folks. Like, I think that people are really underestimating it. Even for the Chinese, it's going to take some time. Just look at how long it took the J-20 to get to where it is. Yes, it's being offered for export, but the whole point, I can argue from AWACS standpoint, is that if you offer it for export now, you can get the funding sooner from your customers, right? Like the Gulf, for example, like the Saudis or the Emiratis, for example. Especially the Emiratis. They were planning to invest in the Rafale F5 for like transfer technology rights. The French said no. So they're open season too. Like, they're saying, how about if the Chinese say yes to our weapons on their platform, which they might. I mean, if it were, I'm sure the Chinese, I'm sure one of the parts of AWACS marketing for the J-35 is that this is going to be meant for the J-35 AE is going to be meant for the customer. So we're going to work with the customer and integrate what they want. So I think that's one aspect. The other is, I 100% agree with you, and it's about repurposing the JF-17 and using that as a lift. Because the cool thing is with that is that you already have, as you said, the airframe and what have you. But I think it'd be a really cool place for NASTAP to come in and actually build out the entire surrounding environment, because that's well within their wheelhouse, right? Things like the LVC infrastructure, simulators. I mean, they've done some work on this already in other aspects. I think it's like for drone operations and what have you, like training operators on how to use the drones that the PF has been inducting. So that's all there. And I think if they just apply it forward with a lift thing, they can build an entirely end-to-end integrated ground and air lift solution, which would just be purpose built for the PAF's needs, right, with its own requirements. And they can start really building. And then once you have pilots doing their lift on the JF-17, then transitioning them to a forward JF-17 unit is just seamless at that point.
Yeah.
So with that, we'll jump in quickly to the audience Q&A. So let me know, Arslan, if you want to answer it or if you want me to answer them, and then we'll just go through them.
We can probably both touch on them, to be honest. So if you want to take this first question, it's better.
Sure. So Farhan Faizi is asking, how can the armed forces make intelligence fusion better to fight counterinsurgency in Balochistan and KPK? And number two, how can we make the FC Frontier Corps better? So, I can go into a lot of the specific things that you can do from a technical standpoint, but I would say this is more of an organizational structural problem. So what I mean by that is that I used to advocate quite a bit, and I still do. Pakistan should actually start amalgamating some of these like disparate paramilitary units, Frontier Corps, Rangers, and all these. Like, I think those are the two big ones, really. And basically form a National Guard. Just get over this. Like, we should have a purpose-built interior security military that works in tandem, hand in hand with the conventional military. And the reason why I say this is because some of the stuff that, that allows for this is already happening. So you have, for example, officers from the army getting, reseconded once they retire out of the army back into, they get reseconded into the paramilitary units. But the problem is that paramilitary units are, again, they're all these like redundant structures. You have Rangers in Sindh, you have then you have Corps, and you have, I think, another one that was formed specifically for Balochistan. I think that's just too much. I think there's too much redundancy and that ends up eating into resources and time. That's the reason why you have like a time, delays and all this kind of stuff too, is that you're just basically creating, and this is a problem in Pakistan in general, you create a lot of top heavy layers. Everyone wants to be a manager, everyone wants to be an analyst, everyone wants to do like the fancy work, but no one, you don't create structures that allow for resource optimization. And I think, you build a National Guard, right? You have a officer school for the National Guard. For example, you could allow more of the OTS candidates to go into the National Guard. You can bring in more civilian people to go in and serve some time in the National Guard. For example, you hire more locally for the National Guard. So, you have your national, the way the US does it, you have National Guard divisions and bureau. You basically structure like an army. You have divisions, regiments, whatever. They're distributed throughout the country. They make it a point that they're going to recruit locally, both officers and soldiers. So that way you have now, officers from Balochistan operating Balochistan. You have officers in KPK operating within KPK. They know their environment better. They have the native linkages and everything already there. Right? You sort of foster the curriculum around the ground realities, and you basically build a national defense. You basically becomes a national defense force, right? And then you start building. So now and here's a key point. It should not be treated as like a second tier force. Like, you want it to be like a second army in a sense, right? And the reason why I say this is because what ends up happening with the counterinsurgency and counterterrorism stuff, that the army gets sent in anyways. That means that there's an inherent deficiency within the paramilitary. So what are they there for? Just to absorb losses? I don't want that for any Pakistani citizen, just to be turned into, human cannon fodder. No, I want everyone who is part of the country's fabric to be equipped to be able to defend the country. So that's the whole point. You build a National Guard, you make it very native centric. And from there, you build these systems on top of it that's designed for dealing with the threat. So for example, here is where you might actually need like a strong rotary capability. Here's where you would need like a lot of mine resistant armored vehicles and other 4x4 LAVs, right? You might have a limited artillery capability, and so on and so forth. And then you can basically, start cross integrating with the army on certain elements like drones and attack helicopters and some of the heavy hitting stuff when they need it. Otherwise, the whole point is that they're there, they're able to rapidly respond to issues, and they're very closely and tightly embedded. So they have their own intelligence apparatus. So they're very tightly embedded within those regions. And then you start, you have like this dual capability where you're integrating a lot of the local, let's say, the most combative capable workforce within the region into your structures. So you kind of deprive the militancy of the most capable people that they could leverage. And on the other hand, you sort of have people that sort of bought into the idea of the national unity and all that kind of stuff. And then there's some bigger issues you have to deal with beyond that. I don't agree with the provincial system, right? I would say you want to break that up. You want to break Pakistan up into smaller districts so that the national center has a much more control over the entire country. So those are my thoughts on that. So I'll leave you to the next question. What should the next lift for the PF?
I think we just spoke about this really is personally, I think the JF-17 is the best option, but there's always the chance that we'll see an L-15B induction. And 346, I think the reality is it's just too costly, and that's the same that goes for the Korean one. I think they're just too costly, and so I think it's really just going to end up being a toss-up between the L-15 and the JSF. But I think in the interim, we could probably see back in Dubai Air Show 2021, the Chinese, they unveiled the K8NG, which was a sort of upgrade for the K8. And I think that's something we'll actually start to see rolling out. But on the other hand, Pakistan Air Force could always also go out and make their own sort of midlife update for the K8, which I don't write off either because they have done stuff like this before. So, I think as we just discussed previously, ideally it would be something JS-17 based, but there's always the possibility of it being Elf.
Next question from Salman Khalid. What are the strategic implications if Bangladesh were to buy the JF-17? You want to answer that, Arslan?
I think I'll leave that one to you.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it helps us with scale. So we have another customer to help sort of share the load of the R&D and overhead and stuff. It definitely creates a level of interoperability between the PEF and the Bangladesh Air Force. Absolutely. All those things are there. So yeah, I mean, I would say that's the big one. But right now, I would say the BAF is probably more focused on their Typhoon purchase. And they signed a letter of intent with Leonardo. I think their first order of business is going to be to make sure they have 16 of those roadmapped or 24 of those roadmapped within their long-term plan. Personally believe, look, when you're a small Air Force, it's always good to focus and optimize your assets. So if you've selected the Typhoon, I personally think they should just focus on the Typhoon. Right. I think there's no need for them to start breaking up different lines of aircraft and have maintain multiple logistic lines and what have you. Not until they're a bigger force. I think for them, resource optimization is probably the best course of action, whatever their decisions are.
Yeah. Sweet. I think the next question. So you and the other members, this is from Imran Khan. You and your other members of your podcast have assessed that BrahMos is a key challenge to how the Pakistan military plan to fight until Marka-i-Haq. Oh, this is okay. That's all the question, right? So this included the challenge for the G-Ban. There is also new information on. Okay, so do you want to take this one, and then I can chime into this as needed?
Yeah. Look, we're not going to know about what the real losses in South Asia are. So at this point, it's like what we know is what we're going to go back based on the very first days of the conflict, because I think that's when the information was flowing as freest level. The reality is that PAF airbase was hit by BrahMos, right? And the concern was not that, oh, did they hit something valuable? That wasn't the point of our discussion. Our point was if India was to scale that attack out by 10x, what's going to happen, right? So is Pakistan preparing for that? So I would say this offensively, yes, it is, right? ARFC, I think, and the Army's general investment towards these like Shahid style loitering munitions, I think they've basically said, okay, we need to prepare like the way Iran prepared. So we need to be ready for a situation where there might not be a PAF on available for long range strikes, right? That means that we're going to have to build out distributed long range strike capabilities. That's where the ARFC came in. That's where the massive investment in munition stockpiling is coming in, both at the high end through cruise missiles and tactical ballistic missiles, that basically the Fatah series, and then also through their Shahid style loitering munitions, right? So that's where the Army's heading on it. Air Force, I think what we recommended, Arslan and I, was that you want to densify your short, medium range air defense coverages. I think that is on the roadmap. I think through the FAS program, for sure, they've thought about it. So I think that will eventually reach its point. Excuse me for the sirens. Again, I'm not getting picked up, folks. It always seems to happen when I have like these details that come out. But anyways, yeah. So that's the first part. Second part is I think the one part we'd be really interested in seeing is distributed operations. So I think if you're yes, it's costly to operate the JF-17, but one of the big advantages of having, even if it's part way through your own platform, is that you can start optimizing it for certain roles that are very suited to your environment. And I would hope to see that we start prepping and ruggedizing the JF-17 for like things like motorway operations, for example. So just stuff like that, I think, would be very helpful. Another thing I would keep in mind is that the PF itself might also start investing in loitering munitions as well, similar to the Army. So something to keep in mind there as well. So those are the big three. Densify your short, medium range air defense coverages, distribute your air operations, and then three, have your own have your own redundant surface capable strike system.
Sweet. Back now, this is a Daniel Ahmed's question. Link 17 controversy. A certain defense YouTuber, I believe I know who you're talking about, claimed that AWACS cannot guide PL-15, and the PL-15 claim guided by AWACS is untrue. It would be amazing if you guys could unpack this. Unfortunately,
I like how we're being brought up into YouTube beefing.
Yeah, we're
the arbiters now. We're the judges.
But I don't think you're going to like my answer. Now, I did a very long, very in-depth discussion with Bilal on a few months back on the matter of data links. And I also believe that the claim isn't necessarily the most accurate, just because the amount of information required and the latency, and actually the easiest way of dispelling this claim made that the PL-15s were guided by AWACS is that Pakistan Air Force uses intermediary nodes between each asset. So it's never like a direct, or maybe, as far as I know, who knows what the reality is, but the Pakistan Air Force has always said that Link 17, that they have like a near real-time data link architecture. They very carefully worded this, near real-time, never a real-time data link architecture. So clearly that in itself implies that you will not be able to get the kind of data rates and the kind of latencies required to be able to guide a missile to its target. So do you think, well, I haven't watched the video and I have no interest in watching the video. I don't believe they claim that these were guided by AWACS, just based on the fact that Pakistan Air Force itself says that the Link 17 and its data link architecture is a near real-time setup.
So I did watch both videos. So it was very interesting to see the South Asia defense space break out into YouTube beefing. I think that's hilarious and awesome. But at the same time, I would say this. It's like, I agree with you in as far as I don't think the PAF has the capability to guide BVR missiles through its current airborne early warning aircraft from the AREI. And the reason why I say that is that I'm gonna release a Kuwa Plus article on this week. So it kind of went into a rabbit hole trying to unpack where all this came from. But basically, like, if you actually dial this back right to the start of the conflict, the whole idea of the sensor handoff shooter capability, specifically in relation to AWACS, came from a semi-official Chinese, I think it was China's Air and Space Daily. Like, it was basically like a semi-state-owned, Halal magazine, for example, in Pakistan, something similar to that from China, where I think like a Chinese industry official said that Pakistan must have used this capability, but he's not in a position to know, right? So that's one issue. And the reason why he said that, and this is where it gets more nuanced, is that he said that the PL-15, both the domestic and export version, are capable of it, but the caveat that he didn't include, and this is when you start unpacking the details, that you need the Chinese XS3 TDL system for this, which is that high bandwidth advanced TDL. Thing is that we don't have, I don't think that TDL has been inducted by the PEF in any capacity. I don't think that is like high sensitive stuff, dude. That is stuff that China relies on in its operations against the Americans. Like, there's a limit, right? Like, there's no export variant of it yet. I'm sure that's going to come with the J-35. And that's where you happen, like, this is where it gets interesting. Like, right after the conflict, the government of Pakistan, I think, released maybe inadvertently a Chinese offer package, which included, if you remember, 40 J-35s plus the HQ-19 plus the KJ-500E. And I think the idea of the Chinese is that, okay, you can get the export version of this high bandwidth data link if you buy the whole package. So it comes out of the box. So that capability is on offer, but I don't think the PAF has it yet. And that's the first reason, is that, again, and the second reason is that the PAF itself said it doesn't have it. So if you actually read Alan Warren's, feature when he was invited by the PAF to basically unpack the conflict. And remember, this is the same force that went out and said it shot down like, 8, 9 Rafales, right? So these guys, when they make it, they're open to making very, let's say, aggressive claims. If they they have this mindset, then they would go out and claim that they have the capability as well, in my opinion. But what they said, because when Alan Warren was interviewing the pilots, and this might be good news for you, Arslan, because you
Okay.
brought up the near real time issue. So basically, the pilot, the J-10 pilot, no less, said that the way the air operation went down was that the Erie was able to track the targets in standoff range, and then it handed off contracts to every pilot, including me. And I was able to track the target through the Erie on my end. And then after that, they just stopped talking. So basically, we do know that there is interoperability between the Erie and J10. I think that I know, because I know Leonardo and even Milsoft, the Turkish company, offer this platform which allows your AWACS to sort of jump between different data links. It's not a new capability, so that's, I think the PF has that. So I'm sure that if the Chinese aircraft was using a different data link, I don't think. I think it's using Link 17. But let's say the radar needs a different interface or something. Whatever the case be, I think those aircraft are all integrated across the board. I think they have as native as you can get an integration between the Link 17 and the fighters. The other thing is that the PAF itself improved the Link 17. So it's actually called now Link 17 Skyguard. So it's not the same Link 17 that we wrote about back in 2016. In fact, folks, just to be clear here, I know folks think we're a new YouTube channel, but Kua has been a publication for over 10 years. So we've been in the space longer than many of the YouTubers beefing have been in the space, put it lightly. So meaning that we're the first ones to really write the feature on the Link 17 and Pakistan's development process for it. And when you go back into the Link 17's history, it goes to your point, Arslan, is that the software-defined radios, the architecture, the hardware was for its time what it was. So it would not have the low latency, high bandwidth capability. That stuff just literally was not available to anyone except the Americans and the Chinese, basically. Like even the Europeans don't have this. Think about it. Think about it. With the exception of America and China, no one else has this capability. Not even the EU. So I think this is folks like the XS3 data link is like a very high sensitivity, like a very, very potent system in the sense. And the Turks are developing their own right now. That's where all the testing with the Kızılelma and all this stuff is happening. They're trying to develop it. India's trying to develop it. And I'm sure NASTAP and RTC are developing it.
Absolutely.
So this stuff is in development. It's still a bit ways out. Like, I mean, I would say, there's a lot of, we always kind of urge Pakistan and Turkey to cooperate and collaborate. So if you know, the Pakistan Navy actually collaborated with the Turks on their data link architecture. So I have no doubt that if the Turks are developing the next generation data link stuff, I'm sure there's collaboration going on with Pakistan on this front, at least, because it's such a high sensitive, very it's not a thing the Chinese are going to be willing to part with easily. And as you can see, like, you have to buy the whole package, KJ500E plus the J35 plus the HQ19. It's like you have to buy the whole package to get access to this one system, basically, if you want it. So I think the PAF, although they've bought a lot of Chinese equipment, I think they still want to maintain, especially with the NASTAP investment, a measure of sovereign control. Again, communications is a sovereign control question. You don't want anyone from the outside having. This is why Link 17 was developed. Can you think about it? We didn't buy some Chinese data link off the shelf, even when that was available. We went out and made our own because sovereign communication is such a, like, you just think about the jamming that India ostensibly went through, according to the PAF's claims. Again, we can't have it both ways, right? As your PAF, can't go out and say, yeah, we jammed the Indian air data links and we're going out and buying commercial data links ourselves. No, you have to stick to some consistency. So the consistency here is that the stuff is going to be developed internally. It's going to be sovereign controlled. We don't have that capability right now. That being said, I do think what might have happened, and this is where the misconstruing is happening. I do think the J-10s are capable of Wolfpack operations with the JF-17 Block 3s because they use the same core radar set. So I do think there's a scenario where the JF-17 might have launched a PL-15 or could, and the J-10 could guide it. I think that could be a thing. I think that is plausible because it's within the same pool. That's like a radar handoff, like one fire control radar handoff to another fire control radar handoff. I don't think that's off the rails. But when you start bringing the Erie, look, the Erie is an older system. You require a very specific type of data link architecture. We don't have that yet. Again, only China and the US have it. High sensitive stuff. Because if Pakistan had it, oh my God, it would be such a big security lapse for the Chinese. No disrespect to the PAF. At the end of the day, America's going to knock on your door so hard for that system. So it's not a risk the Chinese are willing to take. So this is something you have to develop on your own. So that's my thought on it. I'm going to write a very detailed Cool Plus article that kind of goes into the history of the claims of this stuff. And another thing is the areas don't have the range. Like, yeah, it has 400 kilometers, but they're not stationed right up to the Indian border. They're going to be stationed back to the west, right? So obviously that range gets diluted as you push them further back. So the point being is that's my claim. Sorry, that's my point. And I don't think people should see this goes back to the point where the PAF itself says that they value their training, not their equipment. So I don't know why folks are suddenly going to have issues with us not having certain equipment. Shouldn't we rest on our training?
Yeah. And as I said, We did a very, very in-depth episode on this stuff. I think it was called The Next Big Project for the PAF or something.
Yeah, the
Um,
data link one.
yeah, and it talks a lot about these advanced data links and what we expect to see with the next jet, because that's also another investment that needs to be made as part of a next gen fighter program is a next generation data link. And as part of that, you also need to update your infrastructure and your other assets like your AWACS, which is where the KJ-500.
Yep.
Yeah,
So next question, same from Danielle. There's a lot of chatter about the PL-17 being acquired. What are your thoughts on this? This is basically the PL-17 and India acquiring the R-37M.
unfortunately, again, it's kind of just like there's not really a whole lot to say other than there's no indication of such a thing. There's no indication that the J10 even can carry the PL-17. PLA tends to reserve its heavier aircraft, its larger aircraft, and its more capable aircraft for these kind of roles like the J-16. So again, there's not really any evidence that the J-10 is capable of doing so. And there's also not really any evidence that that's going to happen at all anyway. I think it's more just kind of like a reactionary piece to some claims of the Indians being able to acquire this capability. So I think it's kind of just, people spreading misinformation, to be honest.
Yeah, and in regards to the 37M, look, it doesn't have to always be like my stick's longer than your stick. This is
Yeah.
where the other stuff starts factoring in. This is where this is why we keep recommending, like for example, PF should also be investing in decoy drones for this specific purpose. This is why you want to start investing in loyal wingmen for this specific purpose. Like you could, for example, like you could already with Pakistan's existing stack, both within the state-owned industries and private sector, you can go ahead and develop like fairly capable decoy jamming drones based on something as simple as like the Kajam V3. You take the Kajam V3, insert a active ESA arrays within it for electronic attack and jamming, and there you go. You launch 3 or 4 of those with your fighter fleet,
You
right,
also
in any operation.
as a domestic option for a jamming solution. So there's a lot of options.
Timur.
Yeah, Temple as well. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, like this is the stuff you're supposed to deploy against an R-37M threat, because at the end of the day, even the Americans knew. For example, the Americans they don't outrange the Russians and Chinese air-to-air missiles. They know that. Like they don't have, let's say, the doctrine or whatever. But the point is that they always invest things like the MALD, for example, to deal with this kind of situation. And that's where, and I think the PF is, again, it's cognizant. They had that Almortajas concept, I think, in Project Oscar. So I think they're already thinking about it. And so it would be interesting to see that start materializing sooner than later. So yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I think also the other thing is actually we've seen the deployment of R-37s in Ukraine, and it's not been anything particularly game changing. And in an interview with one of the pilots, they said we've just ended up creating different tactics on how to avoid this missile, and that's why it's not so successful against our jets. Which I think is corroborated by the fact that we're just not seeing many kills on that front. So yeah, I mean, well, yeah, on paper these things it's rarely ever how it's presented on paper, right? It's never really the case. So yeah, on paper it seems like an insane, crazy threat, but tactics evolve, technology evolves, and also the Air Force is continually evolving. If we talk back to Link 17 stuff, the Link 17 today is probably not going to be the same as the Link 17 of 5 years ago. They'll continue working on that as they see that it's a very important aspect of their warfare doctrine. And in the same way, with the induction of R-37s or Meteors or whatever it may be, this will continue to evolve, and they'll continue to ensure that warfighters return home safe. So they'll do, it's an additional threat, it's a new threat, but again, tactics will evolve to minimize that threat as much as possible.
So next question, will the PF be able to design and produce the PFX given its prior experience in designing whole aircrafts, or will it do so with the help of the Chinese? So I mean, it depends on what you think PFX is.
Yes.
So if you think it's an upgrade of the JF-17, then they can probably handle that for the most part. But again, we saw a new JF-17 test bed in China, or at least in the continuation. I mean, even that is a question mark. Again, not for surprising reasons. We shouldn't be surprised. I'd recommend you take a listen to our last pulse check episode with Asim, where he unpacks why that's the case, right? We basically sort of helped fund Chengdu with their R&D, right? To the JF-17, we didn't really absorb much in the way of original R&D capability for aerospace on our end. Fortunately. Now, in terms of like, if you think it's like a next gen, 5th-gen fighter situation, I again recommend, I know it's a Cool Plus topic, sorry, Cool Plus podcast, but again, recommend taking a listen to that episode if you can, because and just reach out to me. I might even, I can give you like a free listen as well. It's not a problem. But I mean, the point being is that there's just depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to just design a new aircraft and then leverage off the shelf parts, that is comparatively easier, but for even that, we don't have the capacity to do that in Pakistan because to design, develop, and test, you need thousands and thousands of engineers to run that entire operation. And you have to invest in long periods of time. Like think about the TFX Khan project. In its current iteration, it's been a program for now 10 years. 10 years, right? And they're still in like what, third prototype. So this stuff takes a long time and there are billions of dollars involved just for the top line industrial, like sorry, the top line design and development standpoint. Beneath that, you need the industrial input. So let's say you get that from the Chinese. Sure. But at the end of the day, it's like um we haven't seen many or any indications of Pakistan going towards that yet. And I think at this point, it's like you're not going to be able to scale a fighter production line enough to sustain the cost of the R&D. I think the recommendation we made in earlier Defense Uncut episodes is the PAF should really pivot indigenous R&D to things like UCAVs, right? The space from where they are right now, especially at NESCOM, to developing a stealth jet powered UCAV is a lot lower than going all the way to a fighter plane, to a crewed fighter plane. Think start with UCAV, start with like a 2-ton loyal wingman UCAV. I mean, NESCOM has already built a lot of experience with the cruise missile project. So these loyal wingman drones are basically like you really leverage that expertise to then develop a more complex, cruise missile design essentially. And then from there, you keep stepping it up, right? So you could potentially reach a point in, let's say, 10, 15 years where you can have like a 9, 10 ton strike UCAV, which would be a very helpful design, right, to have in the PAF, because then you can now send these out into the border dealing with India's like air defense systems and Tejas fighters and Rafales and what have you, as opposed to your J-35s, right? So that's the whole idea that you want to sort of now interoperate, integrate with what the market's already offering. So in that sense, I think that would be the ideal route. If there was like a next gen PFX, I would immediately, if I was in charge, I would immediately rework it into a UCAV project.
Yeah, absolutely. But also on the other end, I would just suggest, that we focus more on systems as opposed to, become really good at one thing, whether it's focus on, radar systems or electronic warfare or whatever, but become very good at one thing as opposed to, and one thing that can be applied in multiple areas, like radar systems, for example, as opposed to just dipping our finger in every single pie and being good at nothing and getting nowhere. And just a general comment on PFX matters is we don't know what PFX is. So your guess is as good as mine. My assumption is that it's an upgrade to the JF-17 because that's what makes the most logical sense to me. But obviously, a lot of people want it to be a next generation fighter aircraft, and so that's what they're going to go ahead and assume what it is. But yeah, I just want to remind everybody that there is no clear evidence, there's no clear suggestion, there's no clear idea of what PFX actually is and what it will be. And I think that's actually by design because then nobody can go ahead and be disappointed by the result because nobody actually knows what it is.
And just to conclude that last point, if you remember the photo the PF is using for the PFX is like that gray stealthy J-17 like twin tail fighter. Do you know what that photo was originally for? That illustration? That illustration is an artist's illustration of the JF-17 Block 3 back in 2010.
Yeah. And
so I mean,
just to even drive that point home even further is, and we spoke about this last time in reference to the HD1 and Fatah III, is just to drive that point home even further is if you ever look at if you actually look at the PF calendar and you look at the Hisar, there's a picture of the Hisar on there, and what the Hisar in Pakistan Air Force Service actually is, it's an electronic warfare system. It's a jammer against UAVs, but in the calendar, it's the Turkish Hisar SAM. We know for a fact that's not what the PAF was referring to. However, the person making the calendar or the person making the press releases, and actually we've seen this in the PAF press release as well, is they've just Googled Hisar and picked a picture.
Yep. Always keep those caveats in mind.
Yeah.
Next one is from Slim Khalifa Dog. In the 80s, the ideal PF would have been 200 F-16s, 99 F-7, 54 A-5s, 96 Legacy Mirages by 1999. 450 requirement had gone down to 390. 80 high technology fighters, 50, 60 strike penetration aircraft, and 150 air defense aircraft. How do you think this requirement has evolved now, especially given the advent of male and HAIL UCAVs? And then also Air Chief Marshal Tanveer Ahmed stated back in 2007, PF was looking for 250 JF-17s. Do you think they're going to stick to this? So I'll go from backwards to forward. So basically, I think the PF will eventually get to building 250 JF-17s over the life cycle of the aircraft. I think that's been the idea. But they would operate at any given time, they'll probably operate around like 150. I think that's like the general approach I'd expect. Then in regards to the UCAV, so the thing is that UCAVs are a bit deceptive when you think about them, because they are low cost to procure upfront, but because they are such niche systems, they can be pretty expensive to operate over time compared to a more scalable platform like a fighter plane. So there's a lot of caveats with like your Akinchis, your Wing Loons, your CH-5s, and these sorts of drones. A lot of caveats. So you typically operate very few of them anyways, and they're pretty much reserved for very specific operations. Where this could potentially change is if you start getting into jet-powered UCAVs that start taking up the role of certain fighter aircraft, right? And that is the dream of companies like Anduril, Bekar, and some Chinese companies. We just haven't seen indications of that being possible yet because it's such an early stage concept. So I think in the foreseeable future, the PF is still going to lean quite a bit on like a reasonably sized crewed fighter platform. I think the real changes are as you start factoring things like air defense investments in the Army Rocket Force Command, and then the Army's own low altitude operations capabilities through like the Z-10 ME or attack helicopters. When you start factoring all those pieces into the picture, your understanding of how big your fleet what fighter fleet we need to be starts to sort of adjust accordingly. So for example, but I think in general, PF would probably prefer maintaining a fleet of at least around 300 to 400 multi-role fighters in some capacity. And also another factor is that if they start standardizing the fleet across the JF-17 and J-10 through the long term, and obviously maintain the residual F-16 presence, that becomes easier as well. So that's the way I sort of look at it, essentially.
Yeah, I think one of the other misconceptions people tend to make with UCAVs is that they're cheap, small. No, that's not necessarily the case, particularly when we're looking at modern UCAVs where they're so packed full of sensors and advanced technology. Costs end up being quite expensive. Heck, I mean, maybe even some of these drones like the Akinci could even be costing similar to what a JF-17 would cost. And also, the problem is in their current form, they're quite niche in roles. You can't necessarily do seed with a UCAV. I mean, maybe you could, but it might not be the most effective solution. But the point is, they're quite niche in roles as well in its current setup. The Pakistan Air Force tends to use them for a counterinsurgency and ISR solution. So there's also that. I mean, at the end of the day, yeah, they're designed to be more attritable in the sense that there's not a person in them. So you don't necessarily have the political issues that come with a man and being down in somebody else's territory and all that sort of stuff. In that sense, they're more attritable, but not necessarily cost-wise. And just talking to the point where the part of the question where it's saying the aircraft requirement has gone down to X or Z, as we end up having more capable aircraft and aircraft that are able to fill a multitude of roles, you end up needing less of them, right? If we look at like the bombers of World War II, for example, and just after, a single F-15 could probably carry 2 to 3 times that payload. So yeah, they would have needed 2 to 3 times the aircraft back then. But now, as I said, as aircraft become more capable, as they're able to do more things, take on more roles, you end up just needing less of them, unless obviously you have a requirement to meet a certain amount of squadrons or numbers. That's a different matter. But I actually think going forward as well is we'll just see the PAF start to dwindle in numbers because firstly, these aircraft are prohibitively expensive. The J-35, nobody knows what it's going to cost. Some of the estimates I've seen for something like GCAP, the British 6th-gen fighter program, is like $300-400 million a pop. Here, I know for a fact they won't be able to afford tons of them. And it's the same goes for countries like Pakistan. As aircraft become more advanced and systems become more expensive to procure, the numbers are going to start to dwindle. Partly because of the cost, but also partly because they're able to do more things and take on more roles.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth keeping in mind that, in recent years, other elements have sort of taken up some of the role of the Air Force at a more, let's say, tactical level. So things like, your densified air defense coverages, right? That's your new defensive layer, both at the territorial level and at the more localized level, especially as you start investing in like more vehicles with, a surface launched AMRAAM style or FOS, surface launched FOS missiles, for example. That's one example. The other is that you have your Shahid style loitering munitions taking up this like huge bulk of your strike load for you as well at a much lower cost. Again, with greater redundancies and much further distribution, so you can deploy them everywhere pretty much. You have your tactical ballistic missiles, you have your high speed cruise missiles, you have your subsonic cruise missiles. So you have all these little pieces coming together and essentially taking up a lot of the burden that would have been placed on the Air Force, let's say 50 years ago. Like, I mean, what's pretty interesting is that, like, for example, I'll give you an example of how things have changed. So in the 1970s, the Air Force wanted to acquire the American A7 Corsair, right? And the Corsair was like a really good attack aircraft. Like if you look into its design and the integration and subsystems, it was like ahead of its time. Like it was like a better attack aircraft than the F-16 right until like the Block 40 series came out. So the point being is that the PAF knew this, and you know how many they wanted? I think the number was like 150. Like that was the PF's vision of what its force capability had to be. It needed 150 pretty capable strike aircraft in the 70s. And the Americans used that as leverage to sort of try to get Pakistan to walk back its nuclear program. And obviously things didn't work out with that entire angle. And then once that aircraft became available again, the PF decided to go towards a multi-role F-16 instead. So the point being is that, you know, that's how much things have changed. So now imagine that aircraft that you had to go across the border, drop some munitions, come back. That role, the entire core role has been taken up by your loitering munitions, your cruise missiles, your rockets, right? It's been taken over by so many of the other factors that it leaves a question like, what is the Air Force left for? And that's where the PAF is sort of, I think, gradually moving towards what I call like a strategic impact role, meaning that gradually its fighter fleet will dwindle, and that fighter force will be reserved to carry out really specific kinds of operations, right? Again, very similar to the Army aviation thesis. It's like, it's a very high value capability that you can't take for granted anymore. And you want to now leverage it in a way where you get like these like multiple payoffs, right? So for example, it could be that you invest in J-35s, you break into, you use the J-35s to start basically identify and find India's air defense nodes. You knock out a few of the radars, you expose the rest of the coverage net. That allows the loitering munitions and the other assets to come in and destroy them, right? And then that leads to another, you know, another wave of whatever the Army's planning, essentially. That's like a high value strategic outcome, right? So I think that's where, and also obviously on May 7th, the opening day, like you want some measure of quantitative mass enough to wall off the Indians. But the challenge with that is that I think that's where the conversation has to sort of shift into like, what is the fighter platform that we can have that gives us high availability rates, that's easy to deploy, that our pilots, you know, that we can have redundant pools of pilots available for them in case one goes down for whatever reason. And I think the platform we have right now for that is the JF-17 in its current form. I don't think you need to get too fancy. I think now the priority should be, if it costs a lot to operate a JF-17, how do we bring the cost down? Well, that means you have to expand production, build a lot of units, localize more of the support element. I'm trying to bring more of the engine stuff in-house. But the challenge with that is that, you know, when you're working with the Chinese, again, no disrespect to the Chinese, but the point being is that we know incentives matter. And with the Chinese is that their incentives are to build their foreign reserves, right? The foreign currency reserves. They want to be the net gain exporter. Everyone in the world who has dealt with the Chinese from a market economy standpoint, except for the energy producers, because the Chinese cannot solve that problem yet. They're trying to, but they can't solve that problem. Is that with the exception of energy producers, no one has leverage on the Chinese, right? Because the Chinese can produce everything at a scale and cost that you cannot compete with. Now, that is a good thing in a very specific context when you have like surge requirements, right? When you want to like circumvent sanctions like the Russians did. But when it comes to industrial, you know, nation building and war fighting building, like from a long-term sustainable standpoint, you have to rethink things. That's why we always sort of emphasize collaborating with the Turks, Poles, the Hungary, like what people call the random countries. Well, you're a random country, so go collaborate with other random countries so that you can be a less random force, right? So that's the whole point, is that because you need to be able to scale. Economies matter, right? And the economy is the reason why where Pakistan's military programs keep getting stalled or, you know, modified and degraded, because we have a fiscal problem, we have a monetary problem, and the reason why we have these problems is because we just haven't fixed the underlying things, and we keep kind of turning away from opportunities that could be aligned with our defense needs, like working with the Turks on the industrial side. We keep moving that stuff away in favor for short-term gains and flashy objects, and then 5 years later we're asking, well, why did this happen? Why did that happen? Why don't we have this? Why don't we have that? And good examples are our entire critique of the air defense investment. I mean, we invested a lot in the flashy stuff like the H-29BE, but we didn't have enough of the medium to short range, high quality missiles to like really densify our coverages against the supersonics. We didn't have enough. I mean, the Navy understood this to its credit and invested in the CAM-ER. Wouldn't it have been awesome that we put the money in the long range air defense stuff to actually invest in lots of CAM-ER units, or as many as we could, at least enough to defend our air bases with, right? And that's the issue that we have. So yeah, that's my answer basically.
Yeah, I think that covers everything for this episode.
Yeah, so thanks again, Arslan, and thanks again, everyone. And once again, if you have any questions, just be sure to send us an email at podcast@fua.org or contact@fua.org, and we'll be happy to take them. Feel free to also engage with us through our other social media channels. We have a presence on LinkedIn, we have a presence on Facebook, we have a presence on YouTube, we have a presence on X, so you can send us questions through there as well. We'll try to capture them and bring them into the next episode. Once again, everyone, thank you, take care, and goodbye.
Bye.